Let's bring in David Speedie now, live from Virginia. He's from the American Committee for US-Russia Accord. David, how close to all-out conflict are we right now in Ukraine?
Well, that's, of course, the $64,000 question. I read somewhere today that we're in the 80th day of predicting a Russian invasion into Ukraine. I would say that what's happening at the moment is a prolonged and dangerous game of chicken between NATO and Russia, with Ukraine essentially as in a sense, the pawn, although the willing pawn in the game. My main concern, frankly, at this moment is some sort of inadvertent clash as you have a buildup of troops of this magnitude, both from the Russian side and with NATO troops bordering on Ukraine's western border, the Black Sea being basically at this point sort of a marina for NATO warships. There's a chance of a couple of planes colliding. There are all sorts of chances of an accidental outbreak, as well as just a conventional declaration of war, which I think is remote at this point.
So we know Russia is concerned about Ukraine moving further into the arms of the West, of NATO and so on. What was the catalyst for this particular build-up?
Well, that's the key question. The catalyst, if we look at history is very important. There wasn't really any great Russian either animus toward or even concern about Iran's role prior to, let's say, 2008, when the NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania, at the US behest, basically created a path towards NATO membership for Ukraine and for Georgia. And this, of course, followed tranches of NATO expansion to the Baltics, to the Eastern Europe countries that had been part of the Warsaw Pact. And so it was another area of great concern for Russia. Even then, Putin didn't really show any sort of inclination to be hostile toward Ukraine until the 2014 events, where a pro-Russian, but nevertheless democratically elected president, Yanukovych, was overthrown in the so-called Maidan riots, in which, again, the US and to some extent Europe had a lead role. So I think when you talk of catalysts, there have been a steady drumbeat of catalytic events that, essentially poking Russia in the eye that have led to this, that have brought this to pass.
Now, while we mentioned that some US troops have been put on standby, there's no likelihood that there would be a major US intervention on the ground, is there?
No. This is, again, there have been reports today about the idea of boots on the ground in Ukraine. I think it's that President Biden has basically, at this point, ruled that out, although one of the things we get here are sort of mixed messages from the president and some of his team. But, I just don't think post-Iraq, post-Libya, post-Afghanistan, the U.S. tolerance, especially in a time of other concerns, pandemic, the Dow falling 1,000 points today, the stock market, I just think that the tolerance for another ground war in a remote country where we do not have, and this is the important point, we don't have any vital national security interest in Ukraine. Russia obviously does, historically, culturally, strategically, geographically. Russia and Ukraine have a relationship and a proximity that is totally different from anything that America knows. It is a unique situation as far as we are concerned. So I think the idea, we've given billions in terms of military aid. Your clip just talked about supplying weapons to Ukraine. We've been doing that since the time of basically President Clinton. So that's being fulfilled. But beyond that, I see no. Ukraine is obviously not a NATO country, so the Article 5, defend one, defend all, does not apply.
You speak about the connections as well in terms of cultural links, proximity and so on. But it is unique, as you also point out, and unique from other examples of border tensions like that in Crimea, which we saw.
Well, you know, Crimea, we could spend a long time talking about the uniqueness of Crimea. I mean, Crimea was Russian going back to the time of Catherine the Great. It was signed over to Ukraine by Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union back in '59, when it really was a meaningless exercise. It was the USSR. It became important when the USSR broke up in 1991. But you're right. I mean, the Ukraine is a unique situation in terms of borders. If your clip had moved a couple of 100 miles or 300 miles to the east, you'd have had a totally different feedback from people in trenches. They'd be pro-Moscow. They were Russophone, Russian speakers. Ukraine, and this is the other very important point, Ukraine is to all intents and purposes not really one country. I went there for the first time in 1993, and someone said, please always remember Ukraine is 4 countries. It's East, West, Crimea, and Kiev. And I'm afraid that's what's playing out here. In the West, in Galicia, you have obviously a proximity in every sense of the word to Europe. In the East, you have the same proximity to Russia. And that's part of the, we had the so-called Minsk Accords that would grant some autonomy to the East, the eastern provinces, the Donbass. That's been, unfortunately, not implemented by the Kiev government. And if we could go back to that, there are still ways of getting out of this mess without people being killed. Yeah. And you're absolutely right also. If, you know, in the event of a Russian incursion, yes, we can poke them in the eye, as that gentleman said, but a poke in the eye is going to be a lot less than what's going to happen on the Ukrainian side. And it's a tragedy that we hope will not unfold.